All right, hello and welcome everybody to Dangerous Intersections, Exploring Connections of Racism and Sexual Violence, a Zoom discussion presented by Women Helping Women out of Cincinnati, Ohio. My name is M. Joy, my pronouns are they and them, and I will be your fabulous host for this evening. As folks are being admitted, please make sure that you are on mute and that your video is turned off. We'll go through further instructions momentarily. If you feel so inclined, feel free to introduce yourself using your name, your pronouns, and your location in the chat box. All right, as we get started, I want to go through a quick agenda. So from now until about 6:40, we're just going to admit people into the webinar, go through some setup instructions and introductions of our panelists and the topic for the evening. The panel discussion will last from about 6:40 until 7:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, of course. And then after that, we will open up the discussion to questions. So if you have questions at any point throughout the panel discussion tonight, feel free to put those in the chat box. Our tech friends behind the scenes will be collecting those questions, and we will make sure to answer as many as we can during that Q&A portion at the end. Just so you know, this event is being recorded and will be available to participants and the public once the file has been saved and put together and ready to show. This event is also being interpreted into American Sign Language. There may be slight pauses in conversation as the interpreters switch places. So just prepare for that. All right. So really quickly, if this is your first time using Zoom or maybe your 100th time using Zoom, I know I'm learning new things about this platform every day. We want to make sure that everybody's settings are ready to go so that we can minimize any sound disruptions and make sure that everybody is seen and heard who needs to be. So first of all, make sure that your device is on mute. For our panelists, they should be on mute if they are not speaking. For our participants and viewers, you should be on mute the whole time. Please turn off your camera so that only the panelists and the interpreters are in view. If you are a person who is using one of the interpreters, feel free to turn on your camera if you need to ask a question of the interpreter or if you need to ask for them to sign something again. In your video settings, if you go to this top image in the top right corner of your screen, you'll see an icon that says stop video with a little arrow in the corner. If you click that arrow, it'll open up that little box, and then you should select video settings. After selecting video settings, you will go to the next step, which is to scroll down to where it says meetings and select the box that says hide non-video participants. Once you have checked that box, you can exit out of that screen, and you should only see myself, the panelist, and the active interpreter. We also ask that you add your pronouns to your name. So if you open up the list of participants, click the ellipses next to your name or your device, select rename, and then please type in your first name and the pronouns that you use. Once you save that, you can exit out and we should be able to see that. in the participant list. All right. Now that hopefully all of our Zoom settings are set up, I want to make sure that we have some good community agreements for this event, because we will be talking about some really sensitive things, some really tough topics, as we all know. So first, community agreement in this space is to be tough on systems and tender with each other. The next agreement is to value our multitudes. Those multitudes are the beautiful commonalities and differences that we hold. We want to value those things. Next is to acknowledge our limits, to expect and accept non-closure, understanding that we are working within a 1-hour time frame for a very large topic. We're using a Zoom platform, a virtual platform, and so not everything can be expressed fully and comprehensively and cohesively on this platform. Everyone has a different communication ability and style, which sometimes causes conflict or confusion. And we're all coming from different levels of personal knowledge and experience around this topic. The next agreement is to be open to growth and accountability. We're hosting this discussion tonight because there are deep, deep wounds in our country and around the world. And so we want to make sure that people are entering this discussion with a growth mindset. We hope that you will learn some things that you didn't know before, or will at least increase your knowledge and understanding of things that you might have heard about before. Accountability comes in when we say something that's maybe not quite on point in the chat box. I want to make sure that people are held accountable for the oopses and ouches, but of course in a respectful way. And then for those of us who might say or do an oops or ouch, really important that we hold ourselves accountable and accept that accountability from others. The last one is to utilize self-care and community care. So we know that talking about issues of racism, sexism, sexual violence, any form of oppression or violence can bring up a lot of feelings. It can activate memories from our past, and that can be overwhelming sometimes. So we want to make sure that if at any point during this discussion you feel overwhelmed or uncomfortable, that you make sure to take care of yourself first and foremost. Once again, this will be recorded, and so you can access this at a later time if you do need to sign off the call. Community care is the next level. So if you see somebody struggling in the chat box, or maybe you're texting with a friend who's also watching this, make sure that you're reaching out and lifting each other up and supporting one another. All right. With that, I want to introduce our wonderful panelists. Take a great look at this screen, because I'm going to stop sharing my screen momentarily and read some fabulous bios. But introducing our panelists, starting from left to right on my screen, is Corine Fairbanks. She uses she and her pronouns. Give a little wave. Awesome. Love it. Next, we have Dr. Dayanara Marte. Hello, friend. Welcome. Also uses she and her pronouns. Hyejin Shim, also using she and her pronouns. Give us a little hello, if you will. And Jayvon Howard, using he and him pronouns. Awesome. I'm your moderator for this evening. Once again, my name is M. Joy. My pronouns are they and them. and I am the Prevention Coordinator at Women Helping Women. All right, so we should be able to see all of our wonderful people. All right, so starting with Corine. Corine is an Oglala Lakota writer, educator, and activist. She focuses her advocacy and activism on women's rights, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the Indigenous food sovereignty, and is the host of Women of All Red Nations podcast and program. Thank you for being here, Corine. Dr. Dayanara.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Dayanara Marte is the founder of the World Healing Lab and the People of Color Healing Justice Consortium. She is a first-generation Dominican immigrant and mother of two, dedicated to healing, trauma, and social justice. Dayanara specializes in awakening voices and liberating women and girls through creating healing spaces globally. Known for bringing bold integrity and accountability to communities, organizations, philanthropy, and institutions, Dayanara goes beyond borders to end violence against women and girls, LGBTQ folk, and immigrants on the front lines of social service and social justice organizations. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Hyejin Shim. She is the Sexual Assault Program Coordinator at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. She is a queer Korean bilingual anti-violence advocate and community organizer based in Oakland, California. Hyejin comes with a decade's experience in anti-violence work, including direct service, especially for LGBTQ survivors in immigrant and refugee communities. She is a co-founder of the national advocacy project Survived and Punished, which is dedicated to supporting criminalized and incarcerated survivors of violence. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And last we have Jayvon Howard. Jayvon works as the Engaging Men Coordinator with the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. He has a background working with special populations, doing advocacy, outreach, and programming. Jayvon has served on many teams to engage men in gender-based violence intervention and prevention, including working with different communities to assist in the organizing of the Ohio Consortium for Men and Masculinities in Higher Education. He currently serves on the Southwest Regional Director currently serves as the Southwest Regional Director for the Ohio Men's Action Network and is the founder and chair of the newly launched Men of Color Caucus. He is a passionate organizer and activist, being one of the co-founders for the grassroots organization BRACE, which stands for Black Revolutionaries for Actionable Change and Equity, and Leaders of the Free World, which is partnered with the Cincinnati Black United Front. Thank you so much for being here, Jayvon. All right. With that, I want to go ahead and get us into our questions for the panelists. Give me just a moment here so I can adjust my screen. Okay, wonderful panelists. So we're gonna just take this person by person. I will let you know who will speak first and then next. So the first question of the evening is, what are some connections that you see between racism and sexism? The second part of this question is, historically, what are the ways that sexual violence has been used against people in the racial or ethnic identity group that you are affiliated with? And I will start with Jayvon.
Oh, great. Yes, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. And again, just like a disclaimer for all the questions and discussion that we're going to be having tonight, there's no way to fully answer many of these questions comprehensively in the time that we have allotted. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and decide to jump in and give a couple of points that I think might be just helpful for people to take away with. The first one is actually very important. I want everyone to really take the time to sit with this point, to really take it in. Black women are women too. So I know that can be something that is really off-putting for folks to really understand, but it is a truth that really is what makes these intersections so dangerous, with not realizing that critical fact, that Black women are women too. So seeing that connection between racism and sexism, so answering that first part of the question, will really come down to a lot of the stereotypes and the perceptions of Black women. First and foremost, Black women are often seen as hypersexual, hyper promiscuous, and therefore unrapeable, incapable of being survivors or victims of sexual assault. With that perception of being hypersexual and hyperpromiscuous, we then see that whenever there are any kind of consequences at no fault of their own, whether that be sexual violence, whether that be lack of access to education, employment, or opportunities, these women are then perceived to be as irresponsible. So we go from a place of hyper sexualization to you are hypersexual, and now you're irresponsible because of the consequences that come along with that. And then when that Black women or when Black trans women push back against that, or they seek intervention within crisis, or they seek any kind of support or aid, or even just like try to stand up and be heard and have their voices heard and be empowered, then they're perceived as dangerous. So when we talk about the connection between racism and sexism, I think just that pathway is a great example for just understanding what that looks like. So starting off with being seen as hypersexual, then being seen as irresponsible for that hypersexuality, which is not a true thing, it's just a perception because of the fact that they are Black women. And then being seen as dangerous and then criminalized for pushing back against those narratives, for seeking support and intervention. A lot of that support and intervention should be existing within these communities, but because of institutional racism coming from the bottom and then coming from the top, that is withdrawing resources, withdrawing benefits, withdrawing access that would otherwise be advantageous for Black women and for these communities, and then replacing them with things such as policing, surveillance and security systems, prisons, court systems, all these institutions that ultimately criminalize folks who are seeking help and seeking assistance. So with that being rooted in a historical context, we do first off sexual violence historically within the Black community, particularly against Black women, was conditioned around being able to have slavery in the first place, right? The transatlantic slave trade, the existence of slavery being able to persist was conditioned on the control of Black women's bodies, and particularly the Black woman's womb, primarily through sexual violence, to create that labor force to continue to allow the continuation of slavery, power and control, the psychological, the spiritual, the emotional, the mental violation and violence to control women, and to an extent control enslaved African men as well. And then we also have this fetishization and exoticism, again, connecting back to Black women and Black men as well, being seen as like hypersexual, these hyper promiscuous people and beings because of the culture of how we move, how we dance, how we speak. and being seen as exotic, that somehow there will be some additional pleasure of having sex with these people. And so then we have that overlap that we're still seeing today. And think about how the enormity of a project that has to be that 400 plus years later, that narrative still persists, and the continuation of that violence in these communities. So that's just like one main point. Again, being seen as unrapeable because the idea of they're explicitly existing for pleasure, for creating a labor force, or just to be controlled. And then I will also add, just for the sake of time, for like medical advancement, we see that happening a lot with sexual violence throughout history with Black women as well. Gynecology, the root of gynecology was actually through the sexual violence and abuse of Black women, as well as many other medical advancements that we take advantage of today. Then we also have, we have to bring it to white women, how white women would weaponize their femininity and weaponize their whiteness and accuse Black men of sexual violence, whether they ever had an interaction with a Black man at all. And then that would ultimately lead to that violence, lethal beatings or lynchings of Black men, which makes a really complicated situation even now contemporarily when we talk about holding people accountable for sexual violence, particularly Black men accountable for sexual violence, especially when it's interracial. And so again, like that's just like quick little snippet of some things that connect to the answer to that question. Hopefully that did answer your question.
Yeah, that was a great overview. How do you take hundreds and hundreds of years of human history and boil it down? You did a great job, Jayvon. I would love to hear from Dayanara next.
Hi, that was great, Jayvon. I was like, oh, you said everything I was going to say. But so thank you for having me. And I think I'm coming to this conversation from what I call a healing justice perspective. And really what that means is that I'm going to talk, when I speak, I'm going to speak from how sexual violence and racism is a weapon, a war that is very strategic in depleting the spirit of our communities. And it's been that, right? That's the way to start answering. For me, that the way that they both intertwine is that women's bodies through the spectrum of gender, right, have been used as weapons to deplete the spirit of our communities beyond slavery, right? And so in my country, I think I just wrote about this the other day. It's been very prominent for me, my own story. I am a product of a possible rape in the Dominican Republic. I was born in a brothel. My mother was a young prostitute in a brothel that my father owned. And when I speak to both my mothers, so I wasn't raised with my mother. I was adopted by the madam of the house, who was my father's wife. And I tell my story very candidly because it is the intersection of racism and sexism. And sometimes we need personal stories to understand kind of all of this history, right? What does that look like in someone's personal life? And so, from what I know, right, that was the option that women had in my country of the Dominican Republic. And I'm sure across the world, it is a continued option, right, of work for women to either choose to be domestic workers or to choose to be prostitutes. Particularly when I was born, the choice was either you were working at a military place, kind of taking care of military men, cleaning their homes, or you were a prostitute in a brothel. And so for me, women's bodies, for as long as we can remember, have been used as weapons in our communities to deplete the spirituality of our men, of our sons, of our husbands, and of our families in general, right? And they've been used as mass weapons of war. And also, you know, especially in COVID right now, with everything that's happening in this global pandemic, right? I think every community, Black and Brown community right now, can talk about the increase in sexual violence that has happened in all of our communities because of this pandemic. But that way before this pandemic, sexual violence was the pandemic, right? That nobody ever wants to really acknowledge, right? That is the epidemic that is happening on a global scale to women and girls. And the impact is devastating. It is, you know, I'm 45 years old and I'm still, you know, trying to unpack my story, right? And so a lot of my work is supporting women of color on the front lines, those of us that came to social justice because we have a story, right? And we said, well, not with me, right? Now one more person is gonna go down if I can help it. And so we came into social justice from various points of that intersection and various points of our stories. And when I do work with those of us on the front lines, we've never really had the time to kind of do our own healing around that. And so the way that sexual violence impacts our social, emotional, and spiritual intelligence over time is that it impacts the very qualities that we need to show up in leadership and to sustain over time in social justice. And so what is that looking now when we are uprising in the midst of racism, right? In very clear, overt, I mean, racism has always been here, but in this very clear, overt way, what that's looking like is we're exhausted. We are exhausted because it's one thing to have a story at the intersections, and one thing is for it to be in your space 24 hours a day, right? And you having to choose whether you are going to, you know, every time you get triggered, every time you get re-victimized, every time we're turning on the news, having to hold that and dealing with that as you socially isolate in your house, and then also having to be there for a client, right, who is mirroring your own story. And I, frankly, for me, I've been like, girl, I don't know how to help you, right? Like, I need a breath to be able to figure out how to now kind of be at a pivotal point of when all of these isms are at the intersections, right? And yeah, and so for me, gender-based violence has always been the public health crisis, the global pandemic. And I think that Jayvon said it, right? So this goes back to slavery. In all of our countries, we have some beautiful Native American, Asian Pacific Islander folks, right? We, across the spectrum of even this panel, right? Each one of us can tell a story around, you know, the fact that it wasn't until the other day that it was even noticed in the United States through the redefinition of VAWA that Native Americans, LGBTQ, immigrants, students were even recognized as people that were even dealing with sexual violence, right? In their multiple institutions, in their multiple spaces. And so even though this has been around forever, I think it's, and we all have been doing the work for years, it's kind of a new conversation, right? It's kind of new national conversation under Me Too that has kind of arisen in a way. And I feel for people, I know for me, one of the things that I said when the new administration kind of took over and sexual violence was a part of that, you know, part of the process. I'm trying to be candid in what I'm saying, but it was part of, you know, the presidency. If you hadn't been through some form of sexual assault, that was definitely the place where you started to experience, right, what it looked like to have someone on national TV saying it's okay and giving a right that was already given, right, to white men and to folks to continue to do it without any accountability and without any integrity, right? And that's, I think, what we are facing right now, right? That it's not that it's just a continuation, but that it was given the okay in this particular way across Black and brown bodies.
Great, thank you so much for that. I'm gonna move on to Corine.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Okay, good. All right. Yeah, I'm just having a little bit of an issue with my data, so I hope it doesn't keep going in and out. So your question was, what is the connection between racism and sexism? That was the first part. And I really appreciate what uh, everyone on the panel has said so far. I really can relate to a lot of that. And of course, I've been learning new, topics of interest. And again, thank you for having me on this panel with such esteemed other panelists. So I believe that there are differences in how hetero men of color experience racism and how hetero women of color experience racism. And when I say hetero, I'm giving respects to our LGBTQ relatives who I believe experience even more layers of trauma and targeting from colonizers and other forms of lateral oppression. Just in regards to racism, I mean, I can't even begin to understand the level of racism that our relatives go through on that. But what I can say is that as a woman of color, how I've experienced racism and sexual violence, of course, has been very different than the Native men that I know. And so there's a couple of qualifying factors that I feel like I need to be clear about. When we talk about Native American, I really hate that term because it takes almost 600 federally recognized nations and throws them in this big fondue pot. And it forgets that we are all separate nations, that we are all different with different languages, different forms of spirituality. Some of us are matriarchal, some of us are patriarchal, some of us have found that balance of gender equality in how that structure, that society has been structured. So, and that doesn't even take into account the hundreds of other state or independent nations that either are going for federal recognition or have decided not to go to federal recognition. And of course, again, that's not talking about our relatives in Native Hawaiian, that's not talking about Samoa and Guam, or even our Puerto Rican relatives as well, our Boricua or Taino relatives as well. So I want to give first that respects and make sure that people understand where I'm coming from in that. And so now that takes me to my next kind of point. When the first thing I thought of with this question is, point of contact. When the colonizers first stepped foot on Turtle Island, they came with the Judeo-Christian ethic, perspective, and filter. Keeping that in mind, they, number one, because of the doctrine of discovery, hadn't even thought of Native people as actual human beings. We were just part of the flora and fauna, like the deer and the rabbits that were running around. They didn't see us as actual human beings with a very complex civilized structure. In that complexity, and again, I'm going to generalize to a certain degree, the point of contact, women had power. Our ancestors, our women had power. We were part of that council. We were part of that structure in combination to a council of gender. And so when there was that point of contact, that is not something that was given acknowledged to. So when these colonizers came over, they only wanted to deal with the men. Now, to me right there, that says a lot because they're already objectifying the women that were here before they got here. So that sets up a very strange, because if you're talking about a structure, a matriarchal structure where women have the majority of the power, and they're not even being looked at, they're seen as less than because of the Judeo-Christian ethic that they are bringing over, that patriarchy that's coming over to this land, that's already setting up problems. Not only that, it's when you also talk about the Judeo-Christian ethic and the spiritual and religious traditions that were here prior to contact, that gives no respect to the differences and actually kind of gives even more indication of where there would be problems on not just communication, but on roles, gender roles, and how these colonizers were going to try to oppress that. So I think one of the things too is that in my research, I have kind of noted that sexual violence is part of the methodology of colonization and genocide. That's how you take over. That's part of that colonization process, as well as taking the language, as well as prohibiting practices of spirituality, as well as separating families. You know, there's a whole formula on how people are colonized, and that happened from point one when people came over here. So it's you know, it's, you know, when we talk about sexual violence and Native women, Indigenous women, I guess the other thing that I kind of come up to and see is that, you know, there's this famous proverb, and I don't really know who actually said it. I don't know if too many people know who said it, but it said that, you know, we would not be conquered unless the hearts of our women were killed and laid on the ground. So it was recognized that women were the future. We had future. We carried future in our womb. And not only that, we were the caretakers of our social structures. We were also the caretakers, and we preserved language, and we preserved the traditions and the customs, the cultural identity, which was what kept us as people alive. You know, and the other thing that I felt that is kind of an interesting point is that when we hear about Native massacres, we also kind of see that there's often a connection to the women and children being massacred in these points of conflict. That wasn't just because they were the most vulnerable to society. There's been many documented facts that women knew how to fight just as well as the men did. But I think that these colonizers recognized and knew pretty quickly that in order to subjugate, oppress, and you know, genocide, ethnocide, you know, you had to get the women first, and the children, of course, were the next step. Because if you could get them out of the way, then that was going to, you know, it was going to be a lot easier to control, dominate, and further massacre the men, because they would have nothing to come back to. I mean, you take away family, you take away someone's will to live. You take away community, you take away someone's will to live. And I think we can say the same thing in regards to spirituality as well. So those were the first couple things that kind of came into my mind. And then, of course, you know, when we talk about the Native American experience or the Indigenous experience, we can also kind of look at how, you know, the Catholic Church, Catholicism, played a huge role in the genocide of Native people, and how that often had to do with the rape and the, you know, the miscarriage of justice, the miscarriage, the actual physical miscarriage, the beatings that took place, the rapes, you know, that took place, when we're talking about Christian boarding schools that Native people were forced, kidnapped, and made to live in. We're also talking about the California mission system that were known as death camps to Native Californian people. You know, so again, to me, that speaks to not just white supremacy, but white spiritual supremacy, and also in reaffirming that doctrine of discovery. And for a lot of your listeners or Zoomers, sorry, I'm new to the term, Zoomers, for all of you people that are out there listening, that doctrine of discovery has never been challenged, or actually, no, pardon me, it has been challenged, but it's never been revoked. And the last time it was challenged in the Supreme Court was 2005. And it was reaffirmed that Indigenous people had no right to own any kind of land, that we were still seen as less than human, as was in 1493 with that papal bull saying that if you weren't Christian, well, then you weren't really a full human being. Now, mind you, this is in Supreme Court now. We're in 2020, and this is still on the books. And you still have Ruth Ginsburg that has backed that up at least twice in her, you know, in her Supreme Court, you know, legacy and career. So on one hand, you have Ruth Ginsburg, who's done amazing thing for people of color and women. However, it's interesting that she still reaffirmed the doctrine of discovery. And a lot of people don't know that, but it really upsets me that we talk about intersection, and just because someone appears to be, let's say, politically correct in our standards, doesn't mean they're clearly politically correct in all standards. So there's a lot more I can say on that, but I wanted to kind of keep it streamlined, and I hope I made my points clear on that. But thanks again for having me on this wonderful panel.
Yeah, thank you, Corine. There's so much history we have yet to realize. As we know, many stories have been erased and lost and silenced over the years. I want to finish off this first question with Hyejin. If you could give us your perspective, and then we will move on to the next question.
Sure, thank you everyone. I really enjoyed getting to hear from all of my co-panelists, and I think I just really appreciated that over and over again people said, paraphrasing all of you, but that rape, that sexual violence are weapons of war, conquest, and colonization. And I think the way that it's impossible to really separate out the experiences of racism and sexism, particularly for women of color, I think it's important to also note that it isn't just that women of color are at the intersections of race and gender, but also that white women benefit from this as well, benefit from racism against women of color, benefit from sexism, racialized sexism against women of color. And whether that's through domestic labor that tends to be, you know, women of color, and many different forms of exploited labor that are overwhelmingly women of color. I think it's just important to highlight that when we talk about gender and talk about race together, because like the face of feminism in the United States, the face of gender violence, or like being a survivor of violence in the United States, is overwhelmingly white. And I think that can make it very difficult for women of color to be seen as actual people who are survivors, who are experiencing multitudes every day. And I think the historical part of it, for me, I'm Korean, so I think the most common reference to sexual violence in Korea is known as the comfort system that the Japanese military instated with the sexual slavery of Korean women and other, you know, women across Asia as well, for the military. And I think, you know, it wasn't just that the system of sexual violence through Japanese colonization ended with the Japanese leaving Korea, but that's right after the Japanese military left, the US military came in and is still occupying Korea. And I believe I think the border between North and South Korea is the most militarized zone in the world, with filled with landmines, filled with military, filled with everything, all kinds of stuff. And I think with the US military in Korea, there has been kind of this continuation of Japanese colonization where there was overwhelming, like there were multiple military dictatorships in Korea, South Korea, which a lot of people are surprised to learn about. But through those dictatorships that were backed by the US military, there were massacres and there was mass sexual violence. And I think like Dayanara said earlier, with the presence of the military comes a lot of gender violence and and just the production of so much devastation. And I think with another interesting thing about gender violence and wartime is that I think particularly in Asia is where we see where the birth of the transnational adoption industry began. And I think for Native communities where children were stolen from their families, I think that is something that happens today, like all across the world, where you know, women of color who are living in poverty in the global South from nations that are directly exploited by the United States can't always afford to keep taking care of their children, and then they're sent off to the United States to live. And I think just that legacy of the adoption industry too is also a conversation that needs to be included about sexual violence, because with children of color that are adopted into white families is an epidemic of sexual violence and incest as well that is often not talked about. So I think another thing too is that I'll try to keep it short because I feel like, you know, a lot of the stuff I would have wanted to say has already been said, and I am mindful of time. But I think with how Asian women are racialized in the US today as being sexualized, as being very submissive, as being very docile, that is a very direct linkage from US occupation in Asia and the many, many military bases and the real like contact with Asian women first being through wartime sexual violence, through US occupation, through the military sex industry. So I think that current sexualization and racialization of Asian women is very much connected to a history of military occupation and war as well. And yeah, I think that is all I want to say for now, but I really appreciate just the thoroughness with which everyone has already answered. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. We are running short on time, of course, because this is such a wonderful conversation. And like I said, there's so much history and nuance and intersectionality happening in the conversation. I want to, now that we've kind of covered the past and the present a little bit with how this manifests, how sexual violence manifests in addition to racism or as a tool of racism, I want us to think about change that can be made to prevent both racism and sexism or sexual violence. Specifically looking at the social ecological model. So for those of you who aren't familiar of that model, I am going to share my screen really quickly and pull that up for you as a visual. So what we see here is a nest of relationships, starting with the individual there at the bottom, surrounded by relationships with friends and family, colleagues, coworkers, those one-to-one relationships. The next level that surrounds both relationships and individuals are communities, the values that are in our communities, the norms that are in our communities. And then surrounding community, relationship, and individual is our societal level. These are things like gender norms, other social norms, as well as policies and procedures, those things that really create systemic forms of power, privilege, and oppression. When we think about working to prevent violence, whether that is racial violence or sexualized racial violence or any combination of oppressions and violence. What we know is that we have to work at each one of these levels in order to prevent violence at each one of these levels. Most of the time though, a lot of programs and things focus on just the individual or just the individual relationships that we have and only work at that level. And what we know is that we really need a much wider approach in order to prevent these things. So when we're talking about stopping racism, we have to work at the community level. We have to work at the societal level to really make deep, deep change, because those are the places where those deep, deep inequalities and power dynamics exist and persist. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to our panelists. And I want us to think about, panelists, we'll just kind of open this up popcorn style, if you could give some brief responses. What are some things at the community and societal levels that you think could be changed in order to prevent both racism and sexual violence?
I'd like to take a crack at that. Okay, so one of the things that's kind of been involved right now, that's kind of been heavy right now, is the Washington football team changing their name, and how that has been, that's been going on since the 1960s. that the Native American community has wanted to have them change the name because we considered that a racial slur, and based on the historical perspective of where the term Redskins come from. And for those of you that don't know, it comes from a time that was one of the most bloodiest for us, where the U.S. government paid people to scalp braves. I guess they would, men, it would be $50, women and children would be $5 for a scalp. And so then we have a Washington football team that's there in the capital of the United States that's using this racial slur. So that was, you know, that was good to see that. But it's an interesting connection that this team also just recently was confronted with, I think it was 14 or 15 women on staff that claimed sexual harassment and sexual inappropriate behavior from that team. So that's an interesting connection. But we as Native people have always, you know, felt that there was a connection with sexual, you know, violence perpetuated against Native women, Indigenous women, through that mascot, let's say pipeline, because I'm gonna talk about pipelines in just a moment. But anyways, through that connection, there has been data that supports that when you characterize, when you dehumanize a culture, a group of people, a community of people, then it's harder for them to see their needs, their life and death struggles. It's easier to objectify them. And we can see that when you have the tomahawk chop. We can see that when you have Halloween, people buying costumes called Pocahontas, very sexualized in nature. I mean, even, you know, you see that even in the way people dress at some of these sporting events, not just the men with the fake stupid war bonnet that they think is really cool, not just that, but also the women that try to dress like quote unquote a squaw, which again is another racial slur and sexual slur, which for those of your audience that don't know, it actually has a definition of a woman's genitalia. So when you call someone a squaw, this is my little squaw, you're calling them a pretty demeaning, I'm sure everybody knows what I'm getting at with that. So yes, definitely changing mascots is a huge thing that's happening right now. I don't think there's been a lot of focus on that. I think the Washington team is great, but of course, I'm sure, you know, Ohio actually is the state that has the largest amount of native themed mascot teams in the United States, from elementary to high school to college and professional sporting teams. But I think that also what we also need to look at too, when we're looking at that social ecological model, the first thing that kind of hits me is that, you know, what is being taught in public schools? Our tax money goes to public schools. There is a reason why authentic, true history of Native genocide is not being taught there. There's a reason why the United States has never been tried for crimes against humanity, for not only what they've done for indigenous people in the northern hemisphere, but also because of the transatlantic slave trade as well. It's never been forced into a corner where the United States, especially, I'd love to see it during Trump's administration, my God. It would be awesome to hold them accountable for all of this and for what it's still being perpetuated, especially in his administration. So when I say public schools, I'm not just talking about authentic history, but I'm also talking about, you know, there's a language requirement in high school. I don't know if it's still this way. I believe it is. When I was in high school, you had to take a foreign language. It was either Spanish, French, German, or Latin. It wasn't just recommended. It was part of what was going to help you to graduate. So my problem with that is those are all languages of colonizers, but yet you're on native land.
It looks like we're having some technical difficulties with Corine's feed.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So what I'm saying is that you're on stolen native land, and yet these children don't even know whose territories they're on. If you're in Santa Barbara, California, a lot of those public school children don't know they're on Chumash land. Or if you're in Los Angeles County, a lot of those public school children don't know that you're either on Neva land, or you're on Achaman land, or you're also on Chumash land. So what I'm saying is that should be required. You should be required to know the history and whose native nation you are lucky to be a guest on. So there, the other thing that kind of falls in line with that is that when you talk about public schools, you're also talking about a school system that celebrates Columbus Day, that still sees him as a hero. In Montana and and Wyoming, they still see Custer as a hero. Custer, for some of you that don't know, the 7th Cavalry, all of those people, the 7th Cavalry received medals of honor for the massacre of women and children. That has never been rescinded. They're still seen as heroes. So when we talk about Halloween, the trauma that Native children that are very connected to their Native community feel with Columbus Day, the historical trauma that they feel with Halloween when people, little kids dressing up as, natives. And I've seen little kids dress up in other people of color costumes, but it's hideous. When you talk about President's Day, each one of those presidents have done things against Native people, have contributed to genocide. So, I mean,
Corine,
you get where I'm going. So
thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. I mean, there's a lot to be changed there, right? Everything from the holidays that we celebrate. Why do we choose those specific ones? The people that we celebrate. I definitely think addressing the mascot situation is a huge community level and societal level change that can be made. Other folks, if you would like to jump in and share really quickly, what are your thoughts? Once again, what are some examples of community level or societal level changes that could be made to prevent both racism and sexual violence?
I can pop in. That's a really excellent question. I wish that there was like an easy answer to really provide. I think ultimately it comes down to the way that we think about it when we're trying to answer these type of questions. It really comes down, for me, in my opinion, about healthy relationships and healthy communities. Ultimately, that's what we're all striving for. Healthy relationships help create healthy communities, and healthy communities create the environments and the conditions for healthy relationships. So when we're talking about like, what do we do to organize things? So I'm a studying abolitionist. And so from my perspective, really, it's going to take a great reimagining of all of these systems. It's going to take a great expansion of the way that we think about how any of these systems operate, how we think about relationships, how we think about community, how do we think about ourselves, how do we think about society and how it should be governed. It really is about like just reimagining something new, replacing things, inserting new interventions, asserting particular changes ultimately does not disrupt the system. So when we're talking about racism, particularly anti-Black racism, I think that's the part that I kind of get stuck on with answering this question, because it's the world, is built off of anti-Blackness. That is just the nature of the world. How do you remake the world? That's like ultimately what the question is. Like, how do we actually remake the world into something new and something different? So the way that I usually describe this for folks when I'm giving like facilitated workshops or even like with my comrades, think about it like as a school. A school is a system, right? It is, you get up in the morning at 7:30, you have classes from 8 to 2:30, you have 6 to 8 periods for 45 to 50 minutes long, you have lunch, all the classes are the same: gym, art, music, math, science, history. You have a principal, you have teachers, you have a school board that oversees it all, and you go into this one campus or this one building. That's what a school is. That's a system. You can replace the principal, you can replace the teachers, you can adjust some of the curriculums, what have you. It is still at the end of the day a school. It still operates and functions as a school. The classes are still the same. You still go from 7:30 to 3:30. You still have the principal. You still have the teachers. So thinking about how to answer this question is really, what does it look like to just reimagine? What do we comprehend and defined as a school. So kind of applying that concept to answering this question about how do we change things. So yeah, so that's kind of like my little stab at it, my very brief stab. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Jayvon. Most of my job is working in those school systems for women helping women, trying to teach dating and sexual violence prevention. And one of the things that we do at the agency is not just teach classes on that individual level of the spectrum, but we're also working with schools to evaluate those school codes of conduct, their policies and procedures around how they respond to issues of sexual harassment and sexual violence of their students, and maybe even between faculty and staff as well. I want to acknowledge that it is 7:31, which was the proposed ending time for this panel discussion. We have so much rich conversation here. So for anybody who needs to head out, please know that this is being recorded, and you can get a copy of this, the rest of this, afterwards. There is a survey to fill out. Maria has posted the link to that survey. So if you can, please take that survey as soon as this panel is over, or as soon as you view the recorded session. That would be fantastic. Really quickly, if you can summarize within a minute or so, Hyejin or Dayanara, if you could offer up some examples of community level or societal level changes as well.
I can go super quick. I think what Jayvon said is such a great foundation for talking about the massive changes that need to happen to address racism and sexism, particularly anti-Blackness. And I think something worth saying is what has been popularized over this last wave of protests, and I think that is defunding the police and diverting that massive amount of resources into communities, because it isn't just that the police are committing huge, horrible acts of racial terror, but that the second biggest complaint against, the second most frequent filed complaint against police is actually about police sexual violence. And I think that connection should be explored and can be explained a lot better by a lot of other folks who have done a ton of work on this issue. But I think for exploring more about the intersections of racial violence, racial terror, and gender violence, particularly through the apparatus of the police, I would recommend going on survivedandpunished.org, which I can type in the chat box, or reading any of Miriam Kaba's works, who has done a lot of extensive work specifically on this issue. But I think, as someone who has done a lot of work in the domestic violence sector specifically, I cannot remember a single case in which police involvement actually helped any of the victims or survivors that I was working with. And survivors are like struggling with homelessness, they're struggling with poverty, they're struggling with, getting any kind of safety. And the option that they're supposed to go through further traumatizes them. And I think there's a big problem with the way that our funding is allocated, but the police are supposed to be there for quote unquote survivors of violence. And I think too, it's worth mentioning that within prisons as well is a huge epidemic of sexual violence that's happening, and that a lot of folks who are in prison are experiencing sexual violence and abuse every single day. And I think that is one of the places where we don't go looking for survivors of violence because of racism, because of the way that victimhood is racialized as being white, because of the way that crime is affiliated with being Black or being a person of color. So I'm just gonna keep it there. But I think the idea of defunding the police is kind of seen as like, oh, that's like too far out there. But I think it is a serious and important proposition that needs to be reckoned with and needs to be engaged pretty seriously, because I think we are at a reckoning moment. We're at a tipping point. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. As soon as you said funding, my mind also went back to our educational system and how, and I don't know if this is in any other state in the United States, but at least in Ohio, our schools are funded through property taxes. And when we look at the history, the racist history of redlining and segregation, what we start to see are inequitable systems of education and funding our educational systems. right along those lines. So even though our cities have been legally desegregated and redlining is not a legal practice anymore, we're still seeing the ramifications of those racist systems and policies and procedures playing out in our communities. Dayanara, would you like to add any last suggestions for change?
First of all, thank you. I've been writing a whole bunch of stuff. Corine, Hyejin, and Jayvon, been an honor to be here. I think the only thing I want to add is, I think everything we talked about funding, right, is making sure that VAWA continues to exist in all of our communities. We know that we're losing so much funding from foundations pulling out right now. So we don't have a lot of places to go. I know at some point we want to dismantle the nonprofit kind of philanthropy world, but until then, let's make sure that funding is coming to our communities. Also, I think white sisters and our allies need to kind of step down from some leadership positions and let people of color really run their communities and their spaces and their organizations, and start reclaiming their spirituality, their healing in their own way, the way that it was. And also because of the work that I do, I have to say this, right? But my biggest concern, obviously, until there is white supremacy and capitalism, patriarchy, all the institutions in this country will forever breed violence, right? By default, it will breed violence in all of our communities. And so I don't think we need to dismantle institutions as much as we need to dismantle the institutions that uphold this country, the ideologies and beliefs that hold up this country, because we're gonna have to manage this for a very long time. But my work in the meantime, as we are dismantling it moment by moment, is even if we do get to dismantle institutions, a lot of my work is we have a lot of reckoning to do with ourselves, because violence, racism, sexism, these are all learned behaviors. We are not born this way. We learn this, we internalize it, we are dying because of it. We are finding different ways to survive it. They are banking that we become addicts, and we become, and our bodies start to crumble underneath of us. And so, survivors are among us. This can't continue to be a conversation of like, oh, the survivor over there in that community. It's like, no, they're in our workplace, they're in our, we are in schools, we are leading organizations, we are victims that are in all of the spaces. And so I think my call to action to everybody on this call is, I say every little girl has a story, every child has a story, every adult was a child with a story and an adult with a story. So get to know who you're sitting next to at work. Get to know who is your community, what is their story, and are we creating spaces for us to continue to do the healing as we are continuing to deal with racism, as we're continuing to deal with, sexism and sexual violence and gender-based violence in all its spectrums. Where's our space? How is our community tapping into what they know, their medicine, their healing, their practices? Because for me, they only win when we stop dreaming and we stop existing, even if we are alive. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things that I love that you said, Dayanara, was that white folks need to get out of the way, especially if you're in a position of leadership or power, and let Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color lead, right? When we center the most marginalized people and voices, we make real change. When we give power to folks who have been historically or even currently silenced and erased, we shift ways of thinking, we shift ways of doing and being, and it really benefits all of us. So I want to take this moment for us to think about the people and individuals in your lives that that are already doing this work. Who are some communities or organizations that are already doing this work to create that systemic change, that cultural change. And I just want to take the next like minute or two and give some shout outs. So we'll go one by one, starting with Jayvon. Give me some shout outs. Who are some people or organizations that are doing this work that you want to lift up?
Yes. So my favorite org, I donate to them monthly, so I'm a long-term donor, is the National Bailout, so the Black Mamas National Bailout. What they're focused on is bailing out Black girls and Black women who are incarcerated, particularly Black mothers. They collect the money and they use the funds to pay for bail and to pay for any re-entry costs or fees. So that could be literally paying any kind of fees that come with re-entry, paying for assistance with housing, paying for assistance with food, shelter, clothing, whatever is needed to help them reunite with their families. I definitely would want to shout out that org, and I can go ahead and drop it in the chat as well. But it is the Black Mamas National Bailout.
Awesome, thank you. Hyejin, next.
I think one of my favorite organizations is the California Coalition for Women Prisoners. They're mostly volunteer run and their staff are formerly incarcerated women, but they've been doing so much advocacy about sexual violence in the prison system, and lately about medical neglect with the COVID-19 crisis. So they are doing a ton of work, and it's very much grounded in the leadership and expertise of currently and formerly incarcerated people who are largely survivors of domestic and sexual violence as well.
Awesome, thank you. Dayanara, you want to go next?
Yes, I think as an organization, I want to lift up Sister Song, National Reproductive Justice Organization in Atlanta, who does amazing work on a national level, but on the front lines at the intersections of reproductive justice that includes gender-based violence. And then I just want to give a shout out to those of us that are not a part of any coalition or organization, that are survivors, that are victims, that are doing this work in our communities because we can, because we care, because it's our work. So want to lift up all the folks on the People of Color Healing Justice Consortium. I don't want to go through names, but you know, everybody who is not affiliated that gets left out sometimes.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Corine?
You know, I just want to take a moment to thank all the organizations that are working to demand accountability for murdered missing Indigenous women. You know, I didn't even get a chance to talk about how historically there's always been murdered missing Indigenous women, but especially with, you know, the onslaught of pipelines throughout the country, you also have man camps, truck stops, human trafficking. So deep respects that go to the individuals that are working to try to end that sexual violence and human trafficking. So that's a lot of trauma for the survivors of that as well. So I also wanted to thank all the people on the streets right now that are demanding change, that are putting their lives on the line to demand change, and especially all of our relatives out in Portland, Oregon that are, you know, and now I guess Chicago is going to be coming up on next. So, you know, I want to thank all those people that toppled the statues. Thank you for demanding an authentic historical view on things, especially the Christopher Columbus, you know, stuff. And you guys are awesome. A lot of young people are stepping up, and, you know, God bless you guys, and awesome. And I also want to thank everybody working in our communities that have to deal with this toxic sludge. You know, we have to have self-care. That has to be part of our revolution, or it has to be part of our movements, is self-care, because especially Indigenous women, we're not always taught about taking care of ourselves. We're so busy taking care of everybody in our communities, we often forget that if we don't take care of ourselves, we're not going to be able to help anyone. So I want to thank, you know, all those people that are just taking care of, you know, those that need to be taken care of. So we live in that sense, we live in a beautiful world. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I put the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women website in the chat box for you there. With that, normally we would open it up to questions from participants at home, but we are at 7:45, so we're 15 minutes over our time. If there are any dire questions that folks would like to ask, feel free to drop that in the chat box. Otherwise, I just want to go ahead and share my screen one last time. So thank you all so much for showing up tonight, and thank you so much to our panelists. Once again, don't forget to take the survey that was provided in the chat box and also will be emailed to you since you registered for this event. Women Helping Women receives funding from the Ohio Domestic Violence Network and the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and through the Ohio Department of Health. And so we are asked to have you all fill out surveys so that we can receive funding to continue doing awesome programs like this. So much gratitude to our panelists. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to educate us, to shout out those amazing people and organizations that are doing the work. Thank you for all the work that each one of you is doing in these movements and in this movement as a whole. And I want to give applause to our sign language interpreters, Pilar Baker and Akila Richardson, from the newly formed Cincinnati African American and Black Interpreter Collaborative. If you are interested in hiring these wonderful folks to interpret for your events, you can reach out to Laverne Riddledge. Her email address is here on the screen to utilize their amazing services. If any of our guests today are in need of support or advocacy, maybe the panel discussion has brought up some feelings or activated some memories for you, feel free to reach out to our 24-hour hotline. You can call or text us at 513-381-5610. You can also visit us at womenhelpingwomen.org. Thank you all so much for your time. And I want you all to have lovely evenings. So much gratitude, solidarity to you all. Any last parting comments from my panelists before we commence?
I just want to say thank you so much for everyone for joining us tonight, for my fellow panelists, for everyone out in the audience, and for M, and Gabe and Maria and Women Helping Women for inviting me. It's always wonderful to be able to share space and community with such wonderful people, with such brilliant minds and such passion. So I'm always so grateful to be able to share space. So thank you.
Thank you, Em, for reaching out. It's been forever. I'm so excited we reconnected. I loved the conversation, having been a part of a conversation like this for a while. So this really fed my soul. And so continue to heal, continue to dream. It is imperative that we dream not just another world, but even just to get through this next year, and continue healing. We got to continue to heal. So thank you.
You rock, Em.
Back at you.
All right. And thank you to all the panelists. You guys are awesome. I learned so much tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been an honor to be in conversation with you all.
Awesome. With that, my hope is that at some point, once COVID has passed, and we're all inoculated and vaccinated and all that kind of thing, that we can be together in person and continue these conversations. Until then, stay tuned to Women Helping Women social media account for any future events Tune in to your local or national networks and local and national organizations who are making change, supporting survivors, and just lifting up people on the ground. With that, have a wonderful evening, y'all. Bye.
Yeah, bye.